And a warm welcome to my presentation about state animal welfare commissioners in Germany, also from my side. And yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tamar, for your kind introduction. And thanks to Animals and Democracy for inviting me and hosting this presentation. And of course, thanks to Animal Society for all their great work making this possible. Yeah, you already heard about my master thesis project. This presentation is based on that and my empirical research that I've carried out, like we already heard. And yeah, in the following presentation, I will first give you a small introduction to the office of the State Animal Welfare Commissioners. Then I will guide you through the structure of the thesis. Based on my research questions. And after that, I shortly present my survey method. And I will now alternate between presenting the various theories on the research questions and then presenting the most important results. And I will end with some concluding thoughts and an outlook of future research and what might be helpful steps to strengthen the office. The state animal welfare commissioners, or also called officers or ombudspersons, are special representatives, largely elected by state parliaments or appointed ministers. And in general, it can be said for Germany that the responsibility of animal welfare belongs to federal states. So that is the reason why 11 federal states have animal welfare commissioners and 5 do not have this office. And the first office was established in 1990. And the last established office was actually this year in 2024. And most of them are former vets, and they also used to work in that area. And the offices have various legal foundations. For example, they differ in the form of appointment, their budget, powers, and competencies, or the number of staff. And mainly they are responsible for advisory activities, for example, to the government, to political parties, the justice system, veterinarian offices, animal owners, but also animal welfare associations and private individuals. So when I started to think about animal welfare in Germany, I was struck of the discrepancy between the objectives of animal welfare and the actual practice in dealing with non-human animals, mostly in the animal industries. And at the same time, I also thought a lot about political representation, especially of non-human animals. And in one article from Svenja Ahlhaus, I read that state animal welfare commissioners could be seen as representatives. So I was very interested in their role and in their point of view. So the first research question arose from that desire to better understand and grasp their office. It was what influences the actions and the role behavior of the state animal welfare commissioners. And based on these perceived structures, I wondered what individual scope for action can be derived from the perceived structures of the state animal welfare commissioners. And I finally asked myself, what is the relationship between the subjective understanding of the role of the state animal welfare commissioners to different theories of the political representation of non-human animals? And I know this all sounds a little bit academic, broken down, it is about the structures around the office, their perceived scope for action, and the political representation of non-human animals. And to answer my research questions, I conducted 7 guided interviews with animal welfare commissioners in the time between September and October 2023, which were anonymized afterwards. And yeah, to analyze the described interviews, I used different theories, which I will shortly explain to you question by question. Yeah, starting with the theory of structuration by Anthony Giddens. The theory fitted my research question as it seeks to link role actions of individuals with the structures that surround them. And actually, he wrote more than one book about that. So, what I will present now are just the very, very basics, because, yeah, it's a lot. So, in general, Giddens thought about structures and actions. And the structures, on the one hand, enable and or limit the actions, and the actions on the other side reproduce and modify the actions. And according to Giddens, social actors are neither completely dominated by social structures or organizations, nor are actors totally independent of them. Yeah. And structures consists of rules and resources. There are rules of meaning. These rules provide a shared framework for understanding and interpreting social interactions. And they help actors make sense of social practices and construct meanings in their actions. And there are also rules of legitimation to establish and reinforce shared norms and values within society. And they define what is considered and they define what is considered appropriate, acceptable, or moral behavior in a given context. And there are also resources or structures of domination, which refer to the allocation and control of material and authoritative resources that enable power relations and the exercise of influence within social structures. And ability at the action level refers to an actor's capacity to act intentionally, draw on available resources, and exercise power to influence or change their social environment within the constraints of structure. And in Giddens' framework, knowledge refers to the practical and discursive awareness actors possess about the social rules, about norms and context that guide and inform their actions. And yeah, all of that takes place in a physical rule and is also bounded by time, meaning, for example, that the application and interpretation of rules are context-specific and shaped by cultural and historical factors, influencing how meaning is constituted in various settings. And derived from this theoretical approach, I've tried to look at the structures of the office and, to be precise, the interpretive schemes, the resources, especially allocative resources for material means and authoritative resources for power over people, and rules of legitimation, respectively norms. And yeah, now I will present some key findings regarding the first research question. And I will start with the Animal Protection Law or Animal Welfare Act. The statements in the interviews showed a clear orientation of their role towards the animal protection law. The results of the empirical evidence suggest that some state animal welfare commissioners mostly understand the legislation concerning animals as a compromise between the interests of humans and non-human animals, and accordingly as a minimum requirements in the sense of minimizing suffering. And the analysis showed also that some of the state animal welfare commissioners have different ideas about the definition of animal welfare. While some equate animal welfare with the representation of the interests of non-human animals, others pointed out clear differences between the interests of animal welfare and the interests of non-human animals. And based on the results, that most of the state animal welfare commissioners stated that they are committed to improvements in minimizing suffering in the keeping and use of non-human animals. But as some of the state animal welfare commissioners themselves pointed out several times, animal welfare fails to take into account many interests of non-human animals, which we will look into in a minute. And all of the people interviewed reported that they critically current forms of use in discussing problems, and some also expressed the desire to make demands beyond animal welfare. And the limits of their role became even more apparent when the focus shifts to the interests and perspectives of non-human animals, independently of the use and interest of humans. And in this regard, some state animal welfare commissioners stated that the interests of non-human animals, which are related to positive and joyful feelings and therefore contribute to their well-being, are rarely or usually not taken into account at all in legal decisions. Another result was that the analysis of the role perception has shown that most state animal welfare commissioners see their role as mediating between different perspectives and the interest of other stakeholders. This can be explained by the fact that animal welfare is an intersectional issue in which many different and sometimes strongly opposing interest groups are involved. And this means that the negotiation of laws and their implementation requires cooperation and coordination between the interest groups, for example, politicians, agricultural interest groups, or the general public. And mediation between and understanding of the various interest groups was identified as a guiding principle of the state animal welfare commissioners. Advisory services. They see their role as an advisory position, also in various political processes. A political process can be understood as a process with an input, a political decision-making process, which we won't look into now, and an output. And input is what is fed into the political decision-making process, for example, the representation of interests. And output is defined as the results of the political decision-making processes. And it can be assumed that the output in terms of strengthening animal welfare is all the greater, the stronger the position of animal welfare or the interests of non-human animals are represented within the input. And having in mind what we heard before, that the Animal Welfare Act can already be understood as a compromise between human and non-human animal interests, it can it can therefore be assumed that this, in combination with the orientation towards the Animal Welfare Act, lead to the actions of the state animal welfare commissioners being influenced to such an extent that the results of the negotiation processes are ultimately unfavorable to the interests of non-human animals. Or in other words, it could be better in regards to non-human animals if the compromise is found at the end of the political process instead of giving compromising demands as an input. In general, animal welfare must be seen within historically grown context, meaning, for example, that institutionalization of animal welfare took place within the economic orientation of industrial animal husbandry, and conflict of objectives between human interests of economic efficiency and the interests of animals, which seem to be still negotiated at the expense of non-human animals. And the interest groups of the animal industries, for example, the German Farmers Association, are considered by some state animal welfare commissioners to be clearly superior to those who claim to represent the interests of non-human animals. And some state animal welfare commissioners stated even that they perceive lobbying as the main factor hindering animal welfare. And it can therefore be assumed that the state animal welfare commissioners, as actors within these structures described above, are required to incorporate certain guidelines, for example, the economic viability of industrial animal husbandry, and thus not to exceed their demands. Here, a certain pressure for the compatibility of the demands of the State Animal Welfare Commissioner can be assumed. And this also reflected in some of the statements made by the State Animal Welfare Commissioners, who do have the interests of non-human animals in mind, but do not believe in the feasibility of taking all the interests of non-human animals due to the compromises already discussed or the profitability of the agricultural use of non-human animals. Another finding was that although the orientation of the party and the entire state government in terms of relevance and a recognition for animal welfare is a key factor, it was interesting, though, to hear that some animal welfare commissioners stated that they attributed the party composition of the state government as less relevant than individuals who classify animal welfare as a relevant issue. And this means that animal welfare commissioners depend on certain politicians for whom animal welfare is important, no matter what or which party they belong to. And it is very important then that those people are in the government. And the evaluation of the interviews revealed that the Animal Welfare Act and cultural norms that legitimize the use of non-human animals are at the forefront of the statements made by the animal welfare commissioners, even if all of them criticize many forms of use. And only one person questioned the use completely. It can be assumed that this reflects socially legitimized values and norms, such as the higher weighing of human interests compared to the interests of non-human animals. And it can be concluded from this that the state animal welfare commissioners have different ethical views with regard to the legitimization of the use of non-human animals and interpret their use differently or ascribe meaning to them. And this can be the reason why the actions of the state animal welfare commissioners tend to focus on improving the conditions in which non-human animals are kept and used. Now we will start to look at the research question 2, which revolves around the scope for action. And in this presentation, I will focus on the theory by Manfred Grund. Grund describes different forms of the scope for actions, starting with a role interpretation. They are defined by the interpretation of laws, regulation, and institutional rules, and they define what is officially permitted or prohibited. The second scope for action, according to Grund, arises from social norms, cultural expectations, or interpersonal relationships that are not laid down in writing, but are nevertheless effective. For example, there are contradictory role expectations from different people and groups at the same time that externally affect the individual. And the individual is confronted with various requirements and acts in a different role segment depending on the interaction partner. And this can lead to different role conflicts. The third scope for action is called role distance and means discrepancy between role specification and the realized role behavior, or dependent on individual perception, motivation, and ability to act within the given structures or to expand them. And the last scope for action, Grundnames, is the aspect for social change. And while the other scopes for action often work within existing structures, this one focuses on actively changing or reshaping these structures. And individuals and groups use their ability to reflect, to questioning existing social norms, values, or power relations, and to develop alternatives. And this aspect emphasizing that actors are not only limited by structures, but also have the ability to actively change these structures, which is central to social innovation and long-term development. And yeah, most of my findings can be categorized in the first scope of actions. And yeah, we will now look at my key findings. The analysis showed that the scope for action in the context of institutionalized framework conditions were perceived differently, meaning some perceived their scope for action as large, while others perceived them as much smaller. And one possible explanation for this is that the framework conditions differ from state to state, like we already heard. For example, laws that affect the office and provide it with powers, which is why the associated scope for action is perceived differently. And on the other hand, it can be assumed that the scope for action giving in a similar way due to institutional framework conditions is subjectively interpreted and perceived differently. This means, for example, that a person may feel differently in the face of subjective interpretation and interpretation patterns. A person is more likely to rely on the restrictions imposed by laws and rights and obligations due to the official connection of the office and a possible civil servant status, whereas another person is more likely to focus on a possible potential, such as the freedom from instructions. Another reason might also be that other factors determine the perceived scope for action. These include, for example, personal networks and agreements with other stakeholders involved within the state government, which can be regarded as informal factors. It can therefore also be assumed that the different perceived scopes for action, like we heard, also lead to different role actions. Since the freedom from directives and the opportunity to initiate their own projects were identified as a part of this identified scope of action, it can also be assumed in this respect that the subjectivity of the state animal welfare commissioners in connection with their patterns of interpretation as well as their norms and values influence their individual scope for action and is also dependent on their personal motivation. The scope for action is also influenced by administrative restriction and external role expectations. For example, one state animal welfare commissioner reported being able to work professionally and politically independently. And at the same time, the person emphasized the difficulty of carrying out the professional role and refraining from making personal demands that go beyond animal welfare. For example, what we heard what makes the joyful feelings possible. And comparing both statements with each other, the question can be asked as to whether the professional statements are always within the animal welfare framework and how this is defined. And in this respect, it can be assumed that the animal welfare framework is primarily derived from animal welfare legislation. See also the results for research question number 1. And accordingly, the scope for action in terms of role interpretation lies in distinguishing between the professional and the private opinion on a scale and determining the degree to which a professional opinion is still possible within the framework of animal welfare legislation. But it is also unclear which aspect of those scope for action ultimately weighs more heavily, the independence of the office or the external expectations regarding the office. And the analysis also showed that the state animal welfare commissioners interpreted their role primarily as providing advice to other stakeholders and referring to and monitoring compliance with animal welfare legislation when making political decisions. And this aspect can be summarized as monitoring compliance with the current Animal Welfare Act. However, some statements also indicate that the role is interpreted as improving and expanding existing animal welfare legislation. And based on those different statements, it can be assumed overall that there is a certain scope for action due to the subjective interpretation of the role in connection with the Animal Welfare Act. And so it is questionable to what extent the state animal welfare commissioners are obliged to align the actions with current animal welfare legislation, for example, or to what extent they are allowed to exceed this. And I think further research could provide important insights at this point. And the absence of comprehensive competencies among the state animal welfare commissioners in different states can be interpreted as a sign of their primarily symbolic function. And while these positions are often established to demonstrate a government's commitment to animal welfare, the limited scope of their authority and the lack of enforcement powers may hinder their ability to affect substantial changes. Instead, their role may be confined to advisory tasks or representational duties, emphasizing a performative rather than an impactful approach to animal protection policies. At the same time, though, it can also be assumed that the official position gains a certain significance through its symbolic character. Overall, the legal framework conditions point to an area of tension between aspects that result in the aforementioned restrictions on the scope for action and aspects that enable or secure scope for action. And certain scopes for action are legally guaranteed to the state animal welfare commissioners through statutory regulations that such as their involvement in legislative processes. And these legally established rights suggest that they are more independent with regard to their respective rights compared to other actors and networks, such as new state governments or individuals, and are not reliant on the goodwill and the cooperation or approval of those other stakeholders. However, these scopes of action can still be further restricted, and dependence on these stakeholders increased through additions to these statutory regulations, for example, in the form of ministerial decrees. The scope for action that indicated aspects of social change was identified above all within statements relating to education and public relations work, which can contribute to raising awareness of animal welfare issues in society and thus set new standards, for example, and raising awareness of those involved in the enforcement of animal welfare laws through further training, for example, for lawyers and official veterinarians. Also, appears relevant as they act as multipliers and generate multiplying effects, for example, by setting precedents. And yeah, now I will shortly present the theoretical approaches that I used to answer the third research question. Starting with Svenja Ahlhaus' approach. In her view, political representation can be understood as a neutral category within which persons or groups claim to speak for others and make them visible. The goal or intention is to achieve political visibility, and this does not mean that the political representation is immediately a legitimate or democratic representation, or even is sustainable or a good representation. And yeah, in general, there are a lot of different aspects and challenges of political representation, which I cannot discuss in detail at this time. But for example, there are aspects of authorization, control ability of the representatives, the interpretation of interests of non-human animals. Yeah, it's really huge, and I think in some last presentations we already looked at some of them. And yeah, there are aspects that, according to Ahlhaus, can guide political representation, which I will show you now. Yeah, effectiveness is an aspect that aims to ensure that the interests of non-human animals are taken into account when initiating, formulating, and challenging political decisions. The central aim here is to ensure that interests are included and promoted in the entire political decision-making process. And depending on whether or not non-human animals are regarded as political equals, the degree of effectiveness depends on whether or not their interests are considered equal or secondary importance. The criteria of inclusivity aims to ensure that all non-human animals are represented in the political system, and that differences in the consideration of interests are conclusively justified. And the question of what non-human animals are represented as, like their status, is also central to this issue. However, it also plays a role how non-human animals to be represented are selected, or which non-human animals are represented by the representatives. And the third one, a further criteria is the responsiveness of political representation in relation to scientific findings on the needs, abilities, and interests of non-human animals and political communities. And the hierarchical and influential position of the representatives should always be kept in mind in order to avoid misinterpretation and abuses of power. And the task of interpretation is therefore important, which can be achieved through interaction and deliberation. And here, creativity plays a decisive role in interactions with non-human animals in order to factor in determining their interests. And thus, the representatives must have the skills to participate in these deliberative processes instead of non-human animals having to demonstrate their skills in order to obtain the right to representation. Yeah, another approach I will show you now is the approach by Minea Tănăsescu. Mainly, he is questioning accepted assumption about the principal agent concept, the trustee delegate concept, and authorization and accountability. And in his view, representation can be understood in structural terms as something that is characterized by relationships. Another central point of his theory is the production of the political subjectivity of the represented. And the relationships that are presented and effective in the process of political representation are shaped and established by the assertion and demands that are articulated through the power of human language. And by focusing on the relationships within political representation, the political subjectivity of those involved or affected is emphasized instead of focusing exclusively on interests. And the interpretation of interests itself can be understood as a process of changes in the political subject. And this means that we cannot assume that there are predetermined interests or that there even is a fixed identity of the represented. And but rather that we actually actively produce the represented, which he calls political subjects, and the process of that he calls evocation. And therefore, interests and preferences can be seen as products of the process of representation, which is sometimes quite different than other theoretical approaches. And this perspective makes it clear that the involvement of the representer and their own subjectivity in the process of representation plays a very decisive role. And how can we analyze the representation then? We can look at the relationships between the represented and the representers. We can look at the knowledge that the representers have about the represented and how they gained that knowledge and how they engage with each other. And we can also look at the language that the representers use to talk about the represented and their assumed interests. And also we can look at how the representatives can put themselves in the position of the represented with the help of empathy and compassion. And he calls that moral imagination. And my key findings. With regard to the aspect of effectiveness, it became clear that all state animal welfare commissioners perceive their role in terms of political representation to be limited due to structural framework conditions and influences. And accordingly, the results of research question number 1 and number 2 formed a basis on which the results relating to research question 2 could be built. And due to the legal framework of the role and the predominant orientation towards the current Animal Welfare Act, most of the animal welfare commissioners stated that they could only represent the minimal interests of non-human animals, and this corresponds to the already discussed compromising orientation of animal welfare. And in addition to the role orientation thus named, the demands of compromises can also be understood as a strategy of the state animal welfare commissioners. It can be assumed that due to dependence on allied networks and individual actors already discussed, there is a certain need to ensure that the demands of the state animal welfare commissioners remain realistic and also compatible with the status quo to a certain extent. And with regard to the effectiveness of political representation, however, it remains how compromising demands can adequately represent the interests of non-human animals, especially in comparison to human interests. And with regard to the associated theoretical concept, it became clear that from many statements that the role of state animal welfare commissioners within political processes was assigned less importance overall compared to many other stakeholders like agriculture, which was also discussed in relation to the means of political power. It was also noted that the state animal welfare commissioners are usually not involved in the entire political decision-making process. And as a result, it can be assumed that the equal consideration of comparable interests required by the theoretical concept is not inherent in the role of state animal welfare commissioners. Most of the interviewees stated that they take all non-human animals into consideration, pointing to the inclusiveness of the theoretical concept, and do not make this dependent on their benefits to humans or the relationship that non-human animals have with humans. And some state animal welfare commissioners pointed out that in particular, the animals that are capable of suffering and sensitivity, that they should give them greater consideration in comparison to others. And according to the different ways in which the interests of non-human animals are taken into account, within the understanding of roles and the different arguments, different conclusions can be drawn about the inclusiveness of political representation, ranging from equal consideration of interests of all non-human animals to subordinate consideration of the interests of non-human animals depending on their use. The analysis shows also that the state animal welfare commissioners did not report very creative methods of interpreting interests or deliberative interactions with non-human animals. Nevertheless, they reported, all of them reported, for example, on their experiences through their professional role as former vets and their relationships with non-human animals in their private lives. And it can therefore be assumed that those experiences can be understood as liberation with non-human animals, which in turn have an impact on their role behavior. And all state animal welfare commissioners also directly stated that they base their interpretation of interests on existing or current scientific literature. And this aspect is related to the responsiveness of political representation. And while some state animal welfare commissioners refer to the established basic needs of non-human animals, others question the existing knowledge due to their limitation and restricted nature. And these different positions and views reflect a different approach to the human view of non-human animals and sometimes show a critical reflection of one's own perspective. The relevance of personal attitudes for the role of the state animal welfare commissioners has already been discussed. It can therefore be assumed that the relationship to non-human animals is also a factor within the attitude. And in the evaluation, it became clear that all state animal welfare commissioners have different relationships to non-human animals. Although the statements regarding motivation in particular showed that non-human animals and animal welfare work are very important in all of their lives. The results indicated that most state animal welfare commissioners also see empathy not only as important, but also as fundamental to their role. And at the same time, however, many state animal welfare commissioners noted that they primarily base their decisions and actions on factual informations and arguments. Most of them justified this by stating that emotions would not contribute to an objective debate. Some interviewees also pointed out that the importance of emotions and empathy towards non-human animals is also viewed critically within political debates, as it runs counter to rationality and objectivity. And the people who commented on this called it an attempt to discredit the importance of emotions in relation to non-human animals as a whole. And okay, yeah, slowly we are coming towards an end. And yeah, in general, I would say that there's a poor comparability of the various offices in the different states due to very different legal frameworks, which also affects their actual and perceived scope for action. And yeah, thus professional and political independence of the office in connection with the freedom to issue instruction is very important. And this also needs to be legally secured together with other minimum provisions and rights. And the role behavior also relies on the subjectivity of the individual person performing the role. And therefore, it can generally be assumed that the political representation of non-human animals by state animal welfare commissioners is possible without being limited to their minimal interests within the scope of their discretion. Yes. Overall, I think that there are many different starting points for future research. And to name just one, I think it would be very interesting to take a closer look at political decision-making processes in order to analyze the influence of state animal welfare commissioners on them. And I will now give you a brief overview of how the office could be strengthened. For example, through binding legal frameworks for more transparency and also more independence of the offices. And yeah, most importantly is to secure the independence and freedom from instructions. And it also must be legally secured how they should participate in political decision-making processes. And we also need to ensure their financial resources. Another thing that would be really nice are additional rights that enlarge their scope for action. For example, through rights to sue in the name of non-human animals, or decision-making rights or veto rights in political decisions, also rights to speak and to be heard in committees, or also the authority to issue instructions to other offices. And another important point I think we need to focus on within animal welfare contexts are positive duties towards animals. In comparison to negative duties, for example, not to harm animals, positive duties are about ensuring that animals have positive or can have positive and joyful feelings within their living conditions. And I think that is a very essential point for them. And yeah, we need to keep that in mind. And yeah, here you can see the references I used in the presentation. And yeah, I now want to thank you very much for your time and for your attention.